preparations for the meeting of the European Council on the 15th of December. The next speaker will be the Acting President of the Council, Mr. Korčok.
Mr. President, honourable members, good morning, and many thanks for giving me the opportunity to participate at this debate, which is dealing with the upcoming European Council. Normally, I would start by presenting the usual agenda of December European Council, which is mostly dealing with economic and internal affairs, but today the latest events demanded I start by addressing Syria. We all follow with grave concern the dramatic developments in Aleppo, and the situation is tragic and unfolding very quickly. To allow for humanitarian access, let me stress that an evacuation of those in need is key, as well as cessation of hostilities and the issue of accountability for violations of international law. And these issues, let me assure you, will feature in the discussions of leaders tomorrow. And I'm sure the situation will also be an important element in our debate this morning, and I'll be listening very carefully to you. Honourable members, there are different items on the agenda of the European Council that will start tomorrow, but all of these items have one in common, namely the shared objective to deliver on concrete issues that matter for our citizens. In June and October, I'd like to recall, the European Council set clear and ambitious goals. A very clear picture is emerging today, namely that the EU is delivering. This shows that the European Union has the means to tackle challenges and is capable of finding common solutions. On migration, let me start with that. This remains a top priority. The leaders are determined never to allow a return to the situation of last year, and of course to further bring down the number of irregular migrants. Closing the Western Balkans route last February was a first vital step to securing the external borders. Since then, other important steps have been taken. The European Border and Coast Guard became operational last week, and national efforts have been considerably increased. The number of arrivals in Greece remain very low. The European Council remains committed to implementing the EU-Turkey statement. In the central Mediterranean, far too many are still being lured into risking their lives by stepping into a boat. Given the difficult situation in Libya, the European Council agreed to start working upstream with 5 African countries of origin or transit. Leaders will look at progress and are also expected to call for more support for the Libyan Coast Guard. Apart from that, it is important to address root causes of migration in partner countries. The new ambitious external investment plan and the European Fund for Sustainable Development will be key, and I'm confident that talks with the Parliament will start soon, as the Council adopted its negotiation position yesterday. Talking about security, citizens of course need to feel protected, and this is true for internal security. Just think about external borders or terrorism. And of course, this is very much valid for defence as well. Here, a big responsibility lies with national governments, but the EU can bring added value. On internal security, Parliament and Council negotiators have reached important agreements on counter-terrorism and checks at external borders. I expect that European Council to encourage us to also work diligently on the entry-exit system on ETIAS and on ETIAS, the system to systematically screen visa-exempt travellers. On defence, Europe needs to do more for its own security and defence. On Thursday, leaders will want to signal that the EU is ready to deliver more. In November, the Council, I'd like to recall, adopted a concrete plan on strengthening the CSDP as a part of implementing EU global strategy. This should also strengthen the European pillar in NATO. Those two aspects have to go hand in hand, as requested by the Warsaw Declaration on EU-NATO strategic partnership. The presence of NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg is a strong signal in that sense. It is under the heading Economic and Social Issues and Youth that leaders will review investment and FC 2.0, the implementation of the single market strategies and initiatives in favour of youth. The Council is now ready for negotiations with the Parliament on FC 2. Our Maltese friends will take this work forward. On the single market, many proposals are on the table and negotiations are ongoing. For citizens and businesses to reap the benefits of those initiatives, we as co-legislators need to deliver speedily. To keep the momentum, the heads will take stock of progress tomorrow. They will come back to this in March. Furthermore, the European Council will look carefully into initiatives to address youth unemployment and to promote skills development and mobility. In this context, the European Council will call for the continuation of the Youth Guarantee and welcome the increased support for the Youth Employment Initiative. Mr. President, honourable members, let me conclude by adding that under the external relations component of the European Council's agenda, which I have evoked at the outset with Syria, leaders will also look at the ratification plan by the Netherlands of the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement. Mr. President, this was on the European Council's agenda, but before I finish, I'd like to switch to German. Now,
I have a particular reason for that. I would like to take this opportunity, President, to thank you for all of your work, but not only the work over the last 6 months of cooperation between the Council Presidency and the European Parliament. Martin Schulz has made the European Parliament a self-confident institution. I've experienced this in many meetings and in negotiations. I'm pleased to see that the cooperation between our institutions has helped to make our union better and has made improvements and progress for all of our citizens. I'd like to thank your energy and your talent, and I'm convinced that you will continue to work from Berlin with the same energy and enthusiasm as we've seen you work from over the last 20 years from Berlin, from Brussels and Strasbourg. So I'd like to wish you courage and strength in your next steps in your career. That Europe will need it. Thank you very much.
Vielen Dank, Herr Korčok, für die.
Thank you, Mr. Korčok, for those friendly words. I'll take those as personal comments, because if the Council were to thank me for my work in the European Parliament, it would mean that I've done something wrong. But thanks anyway for the friendly words. On behalf of the Commission, President Juncker.
Verehrter Herr Präsident.
President of the Council, ladies and gentlemen, members of Parliament. I am not going to be paying tribute to you on behalf of the Commission as a whole. I'm not sure whether you would appreciate that, but I am happy to do that on my own behalf.
Well, the item isn't called saying goodbye to Martin Schulz. It's supposed to be preparation for the Council.
Yes, but the European Parliament agenda is not always entirely complete. In any event, shortly before the next EU summit, we found ourselves here in December discussing a number of difficult issues, and many things have changed in the course of the last year. There are many issues we need to address, for example, the refugee crisis. How can we find a response to that? Last December, it was already clear to us that there was no easy nor rapid solution to be found to this. On the contrary, we needed to work very hard to bring about a comprehensive, just European solution to this. I am pleased to be able to observe that we have made some progress in this area, not least because I think the right approach has held sway, and we have realized that this is a challenge which we can only address together. Since December last year, it is my belief that we have made some progress. For example, and many of you have raised this quite often in this chamber, we have taken steps towards taking on shared and common responsibility for our external borders. This is very important in terms of European borders. It's important in terms of national responsibilities too. And it's absolutely vital that we are now setting up the European Coastal and Border Service, which will be coming into operation in the next few days and weeks. Allow me to clarify one or two things for you. First of all, the Turkey agreement. There are a number of issues pertaining to that, and it is vital that we do our bit in implementing this agreement so that it can work. The figures, I think, speak for themselves. Since March, which is when the agreement came into force, on average some 90 refugees per day have arrived on Greek islands. This compares with 10,000 per day in October of the previous year. Since the agreement with the Turks, the fall has been considerable, and 90% fewer people have died coming through the Balkan route than previously. There are legal ways to come from Turkey into Europe now. More than 2,700 people have availed themselves of this opportunity. This is not enough people yet resettled in the European Union, but nevertheless it is a start, and we are working with Turkey to try to improve the conditions for refugees. Having said that, there are very serious problems in the Mediterranean area, not least in Italy, and we would be wrong to forget the pressing need to address that. It is important that we do not leave Italy alone, and I would reiterate that. I would reiterate that because it is an extremely important point. Italy is deploying a considerable funding in order to mitigate the worst effects of the refugee crisis in that country, and this should not be factored into the calculations for the Stability and Growth Pact. Italy is doing a huge amount for refugees, and this must not have adverse budgetary consequences for Italy in any way. The agreement which has been reached with Turkey shows us how very important it is for us to police our borders and to protect our borders together with our neighbours. And this is something which the summit will be addressing closely. We have various migration partnerships, some 5, which we have concluded with a number of neighbouring countries, and we will be reviewing these and the implementation thereof, compliance with them, and we will also be looking at other countries of origin and how we can work with these countries in order to resolve migration issues with them. We need to have a comprehensive approach above all, and this is what we must work towards. We need a comprehensive approach which, inter alia, will enable us to address the root causes underlying migration. And these are the objectives which underpin the investment plan which we've been putting together in order to improve the prospects for investment in Africa. 44 billion European investment in Africa. And out of this 44, the member states will be able to, the member states will also be co-financing some of this. If this objective works effectively, and if we actually succeed in increasing our investment, we will be able to return to a functioning system, Schengen system, which is what I would hope we will be able to see. To move on, President, to security and defence. This is also on the agenda for the Council tomorrow. In this context, obviously, we're very acutely aware of the heightened terrorist threat and the instability which threatens us on all our borders. This is more than clear, I think, to everybody, and this is why we have got to ensure that each of our member states and we collectively realise that defence and security are a crucial issue for our citizens. One of the main vocations of the European Union is to protect its citizens, to protect them against anybody who would seek to attack our way of living together, our society. And therefore we need to stand up for our values and ensure that we can continue to live together in the ways we have done over the past 6 decades in the European Union. In order to have effective protection, it needs at the same time to be credible, because credibility is absolutely vital if you are trying to address lack of security and you're trying to deal with potential attacks. We need to have a credible position. We need to have instruments in our panoply which we can deploy when we need to defend our security. Our credibility also depends very much on our ability not just to be a soft power. That is extremely important to us. But that in itself is not enough. What we need to do is strengthen European defence capabilities and build a real European Union of defence. And there are a number of things we need to do in order to deliver this. First of all, we need to work more closely together with NATO. We already work very closely with NATO, for example, in the Mediterranean and in the area of cybersecurity. The European Union and NATO are certainly far from being rivals. On the contrary, they're complementary bodies, each of which has a mutual need of the other. Therefore, the closer we work together, the better we work for each other. And this is why I would appeal to heads of state and heads of government to show a great and high level of ambition on Thursday in discussing these issues. The Commission will give its all. We want to give some impetus to the defence industry in the European Union so that we can enhance our strategic defence capability. Over 80% of the investment in defence equipment at the moment is done at national level. Therefore, our effort is considerably fragmented in defence policy, and this costs us very dearly, between 25 and 100 billion euros per year. Therefore, we spend 200 million alone on defence, but this means we have only 12 or 15% of the efficacy of the Americans, because there's too much duplication of effort and not enough interoperability. It is in our every interest that we establish a strong industrial defence base here in the European Union. And this is why the Commission has put forward a European defence plan in order to invest in defence research and investment in security and bring together the member states so that they invest collectively in defence equipment and in aligning standards. As I said during my State of the Union statement, we have proposed to have a European Defence Fund created, and the objective underlying this is both to invest in research and to enhance possible collective procurement opportunities. I'm talking about defence because defence is an extremely important topic. And it is very important that we realise that, important as it is, we have other concerns, and there are many other concerns in the forefront of the mind of other Europeans. I sometimes hear the message from citizens that we are focusing too much on defence to the detriment of other important issues such as the social pillar and social rights, on which we are actually working very hard currently.
Ladies and gentlemen, this week's European Council will also be a key landmark in our drive to stimulate our job market and our economy. It is only 3 months since I announced the large-scale expansion of the European Fund for Strategic Investments, and I'm delighted at the speed at which we have moved. It is sometimes tempting to focus on the eye-catching numbers, like the 154 billion of investment it has triggered in 27 member states, or the 19.8 billion financing it has secured for infrastructure projects. But what really counts is not the numbers, but the stories behind the numbers, the stories of how it affects the lives of people right across Europe. Sometimes big stories, sometimes smaller stories, but nevertheless important stories. Like the story of the family-run Indonesian restaurant in the small town of Vrelen in the Netherlands that, thanks to the investment plan, has secured the loan it was previously refused to expand its business. Or the story of the farm in Crete that has now secured the 15 million financing it needs to develop a new product line in cold-cut meats and create more than 100 local jobs in the process. And I could pick up many stories from the 377,000 small and medium-sized enterprises across Europe that are benefiting from the investment plan. Everyone is asking more support for the SMEs, for the small and medium-sized enterprises. The Juncker plan is doing exactly that. That is the real added value that Europe can have, but we need more stories like that. That is why I call on the co-legislators to reach an agreement on the extension of the European Fund for Strategic Investments as soon as possible. But we must also focus on creating the stories of tomorrow by investing in our youth. Despite a 10% drop in the last year alone, youth unemployment is still far too high, especially in those parts of Europe where the recovery has taken more time. That is why we call for the continued support of Member States for the Youth Guarantee, which has seen 9 million young people take up an offer of work, education or training. And this is why we have proposed to increase funding for the youth employment initiatives by a total of 2 billion. That will help alone support 1 million more young people by 2020. But to really create the stories of tomorrow, we need our young people to have access to different experiences and different opportunities. Last week, exactly 1 week ago, we launched the European Solidarity Corps to get young people volunteering or working to help the most vulnerable and marginalized in our society. That's 100,000 new stories by 2020 and 100,000 young people equipped with the experience and skills to thrive them on the job market. That is an investment worth making, and I will call on the European Council to throw its full weight behind it. In less than a week, more than 10,000 young people have registered to be part of the European Solidarity Corps. It shows, if it was needed, that young people are Europeans, that they are eager to contribute meaningfully to society and to show solidarity. Mr. President, honourable members, I will finish here, as there can be no better or more important note to leave it on. But the European Council will also address 2 foreign policy issues. First, it must ensure that the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement is concluded. It is a matter of geopolitical responsibility. It is time to finish the work of this chamber and of Ukraine's Rada when they ratified the agreement simultaneously. A great moment, in fact, in the parliamentarian history of our continent. I would also like to congratulate the European Parliament for having completed negotiations on the visa liberalisation suspension mechanism. Visa-free status must now be granted to Ukraine and Georgian citizens as quickly as possible. We were promising it, they were doing what they had to do, now we have to deliver. The European Council will also discuss the war in Syria. The situation in Aleppo, despite recent events, is grave. There are reports of slaughters, of children trapped under collapsed buildings. I call on the parties in war to see through the fog of war, at least for a moment, at least long enough to recall their humanity and to allow the civilians, the women, the children to leave that great ruined city in safety. Thank you for listening.
Das Wort hat jetzt für die Fraktion.
The next speaker on behalf of the EPP Group, Mr. Weber.
Herr Präsident, meine
President, ladies and gentlemen, the world is holding its breath right now. The pictures we've seen in our newspapers from Aleppo are shocking everyone. Hundreds of thousands of people, children, experiencing hell on earth. The possibilities for escaping Aleppo that have been opened up certainly should be welcomed, but as we go into the Council on Thursday, it's clear that Europe has to act. The first thing that's required is humanitarian aid. We need to ensure that humanitarian assistance gets to the people on the ground. And after what we experienced yesterday with the Sakharov Prize, we need to improve the reception of refugees in Europe. Europe was absent. The international community has failed. We need more unity, particularly more unity on the issue of defense. And on Russia, I think that we need to have a look at what's going on there, particularly in the light of Aleppo. The situation in Aleppo could only develop the way it did because Russian bombers and soldiers were involved. A third of the dead were children, according to UN estimates. So it's clear to us as the EPP that appeasement to Russia is not an option. Putin has blood on his hands, and the European Union needs to state this clearly. So, friends, I'm glad, therefore, that Angela Merkel and hopefully the other heads of state and government have agreed to extend the sanctions on Russia, because we cannot accept this kind of policies. Second big issue on the agenda is Turkey. Recent events have shocked all of us. Istanbul is a colourful, open and liberal town, and it has now been fallen under attack from terrorists. We have to express our solidarity. We have to express our emotions, to say that we stand side by side with the victims. But developments in Turkey are very worrying. Members losing their immunity, the media outlets being closed down. This is all very worrying indeed. So the European Council shouldn't be saying more of the same is fine. No, we need to have stretch out our hand to say that we are prepared to work together on many issues, including fighting terror, but it's clear that Turkey is going in the wrong direction on many fronts. The idea of suspending accession negotiations, as many people in this Parliament have asked for, is one approach that we should be looking at. But we also need to keep an eye on Europe. We as the European Parliament find ourselves in a very different situation. Over the last few weeks and months, we've looked to the Council to overcome national selfishness, to overcome the blockades and stuck negotiations. I'm thinking of things like trade defence instruments, and when without that unity, we will not make any progress as a European Union. I and my group see another blockade coming our way, maybe a party political blockade. I think it's very important to have cooperation between parties. And of course, in the elections in 2019, we will fight those elections hard, but this is not the time for party political divisions to overcome us. Martin Schulz has rightly been honoured as a parliament who's brought visibility to the parliament. Over the last 2.5 years, we've made progress because the two big pro-European parliaments parties have been able to work together. That is one of the reasons why we've been able to achieve some progress on unemployment. Thanks to the Juncker plan, thanks to many initiatives, we've been able to seriously reduce unemployment since the height of the crisis in 2009. I think the Parliament ought to be proud of the last 2.5 years, where we've been able to achieve important results, and in many cases we've had to make concessions. I want to be clear on this, on behalf of my group, that we want to continue this approach. We want to have a consensus between pro-Europeans and Democrats. We don't want to give power to the hands of the populists and the extremists in the European Parliament. I can quote a left-wing politician, an important European politician, Altiero Spinelli. He said, well, he was a communist indeed. He said, the division between progressive and reactionary parties is the frontier between those who fall back into nationalism and party political squabbles and those who are prepared to fight for European unity. Our group continues to be in favour of that approach. Now there's a question from Mr. HADJIGEORGIOU. Mr. HADJIGEORGIou? Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Weber. Put your headphones on. Okay, now you can hear me. Well, I totally agree with what you just said. That, of course, we need sanctions against Russia. But in the AFET committee, how can we actually respond to these terrible injustices taking place in Syria? Remember, this goes back a long way. The British were one of the major causing factors of what's happened in Syria now with the women and children.
Also, ehrlich gesagt ist die Frage ziemlich absurd, ziemlich verquer.
Well, I think that's a bit absurd and a bit weird. If you look at what's been happening in Aleppo, there's Russian and Syrian aircraft that have been bombing children and women, etc. That's a fact. That's why I stand by my statement. Putin has blood on his hands. We have to be clear about our fundamental values. We stand side by side with those people in Aleppo who need our help right now. The next speaker for the S&D group is the President, Mr. Pittella.
President, we would also like to share our thoughts with Aleppo. We've said before, and we state this again with determination and with pain, we need to see humanitarian aid. We want to see dialogue, and we strongly condemn Russia. I think that the Council tomorrow will only yield disappointment and inadequate responses. Mr. Juncker was correct to set out what we have achieved, thanks largely to this Parliament, the whole of the Parliament and the European Commission. I would also like to thank Mr. Juncker for the commitment and solidarity he expressed with Italy. But these stumble in the Council. On asylum, once again, we're facing vague words without any commitment when it comes to redistribution of refugees. On the investment plan, the Council only takes note of the Commission's proposal, but no more. And every delay has an impact on people's lives. As Mr. Juncker said, these are people's stories, these are people. If the Council can't take a decision, then that non-decision will have repercussions on people's lives, on businesses' lives. On the youth guarantee, the Commission made a proposal, the Socialists made an even more ambitious proposal on the financial plan, and then nothing happens. And I'm very concerned about this happening again in the Council tomorrow. The fact that we're not seeing responses from this Council, which is largely a Conservative Council, leads us to the conclusion that we need to see a new phase, and I want to be clear on this. Europe as a purely conservative union can't work anymore. We have to start a new phase. In the last 6 months we've seen Brexit. We've seen elections in America. We've seen the most recent election results that have completely overturned the political landscape. And we're not seeing any changes that are having an impact on citizens' lives. We need to have diversity in our positions, and that's really what provides the wealth or richness to any democratic institution. We have to be able to cooperate on individual issues. This is our duty. Yes, we have to respect the positions of others, but what's certain is that after in-depth reflections, not last-minute reflections, what's happened for the last 2.5 years has to finish, and it's finished for political reasons. We want to have open discussions, and this shouldn't be limited to the groups that formed the old coalition. We want to see the centre-left and centre-right come together, and that this brings to an end the issues that the Council tomorrow won't be able to respond to. So the economy, we need to see a plan for energy transition, a youth guarantee that is more coherent and will give a proper response to Europe's tragedy today, which is unemployment amongst young people. We need to see a real investment plan for and with Africa. As socialists, we've been asking for this for a long time. We want to see a more moral economy to fight fraud and tax evasion, sustainable development, a clean energy package that is much more ambitious, renewable energy targets of 40%, and more attention paid to food security. Thank you.
Herr Pittella, es gibt eine Frage der Frau Abgeordneten.
Mr. Pittella, there's a question from Ms. Atkinson. Would you take it?
Bitte sehr.
Mr. Pittella, Council, Mr. Juncker, Mr. Weber, and all of you on that side are going to, every one of you is going to mention Aleppo. My group tried to put Aleppo on the agenda this week to discuss in the Parliament. Not one of you supported that. Why didn't you?
I think that the European Parliament has spoken on this topic many times, and that we've been very clear in our position. And once again, we express our condemnation of the Soviet bombs that are falling, for the massacres that are happening and the barbarism that's happening. We are asking for immediate humanitarian aid and an immediate ceasefire.
Für die ECR-Fraktion hat jetzt das Wort.
For the ECR group, their president, Mr. Kamall.
Thank you. Since 2010, we've had 45 summits, each one an opportunity to take the EU in a new direction. But how many times have we discussed the issues on this week's agenda? Migration, security, economy and youth unemployment. How many more times until we actually solve them? Almost every summit seems to produce more of the same. Words and declarations to keep the controls set to autopilot, while struggling to tackle both the internal and external challenges. The challenges of building the right environment for companies to create jobs, the challenge of keeping our citizens safe and secure, the challenge of sustaining living standards we have come to take for granted. But how? Well, imagine you are a young person living in Spain or Greece, with youth unemployment at over 40%. You want the opportunity to get a job, or at least an apprenticeship. You need the right economic conditions that allow businesses to create jobs for which you can apply. You dream of being able to build a better future for yourself, for your family, and for your community. But what do we in this House offer? Yes, we talk about the EU Youth Guarantee Scheme, as Gianni PITTELLA just spoke about. But here in the European Parliament, our proposed solution to all this is a free Interrail pass. A great opportunity for middle-class kids who could afford it anyway, but not exactly the solution you are desperate for if you are struggling, like many of your neighbours, to find a job. Is it any wonder that people are angry with us, angry at how out of touch we've become? Should we then be surprised when they turn away from the mainstream political parties? The ECR group of MEPs from 18 countries, we want to show that we understand people's legitimate concerns, that we can work together within the EU and with Western allies, that we can offer the EU a new direction. It has happened before. The EU has begun to change direction on the migration and the refugee crisis. We finally started to recognise the importance of distinguishing between genuine refugees fleeing war and persecution and economic migrants who are bypassing the legal migration channels. And when the EU eventually moved towards an approach that the ECR and others have been calling for, what did we see? A crisis that is far from over, but which has become more manageable. So why don't we try a new direction in a few more areas? On security, instead of thinking that we have all the solutions in Brussels or in Strasbourg, how about learning from what works in our local communities? Learning from anti-radicalisation projects in London, Aarhus or Mechelen. Learning from local jobs clubs and projects, helping the long-term unemployed into work. Learning from local projects that help refugees to integrate into their new surroundings in many towns and cities. And how about learning from what works in some of our countries? What about asking security agencies how we can improve their confidence in their counterparts in other countries with whom they may be reluctant to share their hard-gathered intelligence? How about creating jobs by cutting bureaucracy and liberalising employment laws? How about learning about integration from countries that have welcomed newcomers for centuries? Inside this building, the talk is of the intrigue of who will be the next president of the European Parliament. But step outside this building, and our voters won't be interested in that. They'll be worrying about their jobs, their future, and their ability to pay their bills. So in those few hours of the working lunch and the working session at this week's Leaders' Summit, let us hope that our leaders finally start to listen to the many alarms that have gone off in 2016. Let us hope that our leaders address the legitimate concerns of our voters. And let us hope that our leaders chart a new course and set sail for a new direction.
Herr Kamall, es gibt eine Frage.
Now, Mr. Kamall, we've got a question for you from Mrs. Grapini.
Bitte sehr, Frau Grappini.
Go ahead, Mrs. Grapini.
Mulțumesc, domnule președinte. Thank you very much, President. Dear colleague, personally, I appreciate your way of presenting your point of view in the EP, but there are two reasons why I ask you a question. One, are you well acquainted with Europe? You say that young people can travel freely. You think young people are only those who live in London. Do you know of young people from other countries who cannot afford to travel? And the second thing, if we can work together, then how do you explain for the decision that the UK should leave the EU? How have you explained Europe in your own home? Thank you.
Well, first of all, can I thank you for your question, and I can also thank you for how generous you are, because you always apologise to me afterwards for asking a question outside the chamber, so it's very polite. Thank you. Your first question about travel. Yeah, it's all very well saying, let's give kids free Interrail passes, but actually, what the people want is actually the ability to have a job. They want a future. They want to think about themselves, their families. People want to work. And, you know, this gesture of giving a free Interrail pass, who takes these up? Actually, quite often, wealthy middle-class kids who can afford it anyway. They can afford the food, they can afford to travel, and actually all you're doing is saving them a few €100 on the ticket. And, you know, you talked about Brexit, but just because Britain is leaving the EU, we are right next door to each other. It doesn't stop people travelling and intermingling. You don't need a political integration for people to travel and meet each other. We can, in fact, be more global in this way. Thank you.
Für die Fraktion der Liberalen und Demokraten.
On behalf of the Liberals and Democrats in the European Parliament, Mr. Verhofstadt.
Sure, President. First of all, I'm not going to start to say farewell to you. I think that's for the next session that we're going to do. But I want to say welcome to somebody who is new here. Ska Keller is the new leader of the Green group. And we know already each other. She was Spitzenkandidatin. I know she's a very good debater, so I say welcome to her in this mandate. So we have already heard it a few times this morning. Everybody is talking about Aleppo, some I think with good intentions, some with less good intentions. The ENF was asking to put that point on the agenda, but that's to say that they have liberated Aleppo. That's the reason that they wanted it to the agenda, not to deplore the thousands of people, men, women and children, who were killed by those who you are supporting for the moment. Russian airplanes, the troops of Assad. And so it's completely cynical to even try to put from your side it on the agenda of the European Parliament, where you are the cause of what is happening for the moment in Aleppo. It's a shame. What should be far better is to listen a little bit better to what the testimony of yesterday, the testimony of Nadia and Lamia, the Yazidi women, the horrific things that they went through. Because the horrific things that they went through is exactly what is now happening in the streets there, where the Assad people, army, and also the Shiites, Iranians, commandos are going from door to kill people, to kill women, to kill children. And so my request to you and to the Council is, what are you going to do about it? Yeah, you're going to deplore it like we all deplore it here, but you have the power to do something more. What you could do is say, well, we need to do three things: ceasefire, we need to have the free entrance of humanitarian aid to eastern Aleppo, and three, we need to sit around the table to find a political solution. And if those who don't want to do it don't do it, we, European Union, launch a number of sanctions towards Russia, towards the Assad regime, towards Iran, because they are their commandos for the moment who are doing these atrocities inside Aleppo. That you can do. So we can deplore, you can deplore, but you have the power tomorrow in the European Council to take that decision. And that's my request to you. Not only to come here and say, yeah, there's a problem, but to take an initiative. And the initiative can only be that the European is launching a new package of sanctions against these people if they don't comply with these three human, I should say, human requests that we have today in the case of Aleppo. And that's also the reason why I hope that on the defence union we make progress, as has been said by President Juncker, not only by making a fund, I think, Jean-Claude, but also by starting to integrate all these multiple defence cooperation we have in the European Union. It's an inflation of defence cooperation inside the Union. We have the Benelux, we have the Baltics working together, the Scandinavian countries working together, we have Eurocorps, we have the French-Italian cooperation, we have the Dutch-German cooperation. What we need to do is to integrate that in a defence union and with Eurocorps in one structure, so that we can find a solution for the scandal what we have today, that we are in fact spending 42% of the American expenditures in military, and we can only do 15% of their operations in reality. That means that we are 3 to 4 times less effective than the American army. That's the reality. So, second thing, defence union. Finally, take the decision and start, first of all, the proposals from the Commission and then further on. And then three, I hope that, Mr. President, that I have seen that in the Council conclusions there is also a point on the format of the Brexit negotiations. I have to tell you in what time you are living for the moment in the Council. I think you are still in the 20th century or something like that, before the 70s, because I have the impression that you have never read the Treaty of Maastricht and the Treaty of Lisbon and the powers of the European Union and the European Parliament. What they are proposing is simply to say, oh, we go forward with the Brexit negotiations, but without a parliament. We can invite Sherpas, maybe, but that's over, that's all. You are not aware that we have to approve these arrangements? At the end, you're aware of it. Okay, that's already an enormous step forward. But I'm going to tell you, it's time that you also involve the parliament from day one. Do you want that we open separate negotiations with the British authorities? Isn't that what you want? You can get it, huh? If that's what the heads of states want, we're going to do it. Parallel negotiations. I don't want it, but apparently the Council wants it. Maybe I can give you, I don't know who gave it to me a few minutes ago. Yeah, it's a famous phrase of Lyndon B. Johnson. Lyndon B. Johnson is not always very accurate, but okay, I'm going to use it. He said once, better to have him inside the tent pissing out than outside the tent pissing in. Maybe that's a good reality that you can recall to the European Council. Thank you.
Herr Verhofstadt, ich weiß nicht, ob ich morgen in meiner Rede...
Now, Mr. Verhofstadt, I don't know if I'll quote that Lyndon B. Johnston citation in the Council tomorrow, but one thing is clear. The point that you've just addressed is one that I will raise at the meeting of the Conference of Presidents. Now, Mr. Korčok, I have to say this straight to you. The draft conclusions of the European Council, which makes it clear that the Council sees the Parliament as an unpleasant burden in negotiations. Well, I can only say that the European Parliament, from the first minute, at both the level of the Sherpas and the European Council, we have, I say that we're moving towards quite a confrontational period of time. Now, Mr. Coburn has a question for you, as always.
And please. Yeah, rubbish.
Danke, Herr President. Danke, Mr. Verhofstadt. Mr. Putin is no angel. He locks up homosexuals, he does all sorts of appalling things. And Mr. Assad is an equally appalling dictator. But the thing is, the Middle East has instability because the West has undermined Arab dictators. Now, the real enemy in the Middle East is not people like Assad. The real enemy is fundamentalist theocracy. That is terrifying not only to the Russians in their southern republics, but it is terrifying to the European Union with many cities with large Muslim populations. Do you not agree with me, Mr. Verhofstadt, that this Parliament is basically a bourgeois playpen and is not giving the working class or the people of the Middle East a decent break? It's just a lot of hot air for student radicals from the 1960s to air the contents of their stomachs. Thank you.
Bitte, Herr Verhofstadt.
I don't think that was a question of Mr. Coburn. The only thing what I know is that this morning the spokesperson of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the United States of America have said that what for the moment the Russians and the Assad regime is doing is not fighting against the Islamic State. What they are doing is fighting against the moderate opposition to get rid of them. And I'm not saying that. That's the intelligence what the Americans have for the moment. And if you continue to support this Russian atrocities, Assad atrocities, I think you are also co-responsible for this humanitarian crisis that is happening for the moment in Aleppo.
Das Wort hat jetzt für die Vereinigten.
Now on behalf of the United European Left, Mrs. Forenza.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you very much indeed, President. I imagine that when it meets tomorrow, the Council will, amongst other things, be taking note of the result of the referendum which took place in Italy on the 4th of December. This is a referendum where the Italian citizens rejected a proposed modification of the constitution in Italy. JP Morgan was behind this and a constitution for the whole of the south of Europe. We're very happy that the no won the day. We're happy that the Constitution of Italy, which was born of the resistance, has actually continued in existence. We need to have a government of change, yes. Matteo Renzi's proposed constitution has now brought about the fall of his government, and he is indeed one of those who has betrayed the migration compact, which is going to be discussed at the next council. What in fact is being put forward is proposing cooperation with the African states predicated on border control with 5 transition countries which were mentioned a short while ago. The consequences are manifold and many and are gradually beginning to emerge. In the south of Eritrea, for example, there are massive numbers of arrests taking place. Numerous NGOs are talking about an agreement which is utterly shameful. Shameful because it simply externalizes the border control problems which have already caused problems in the European Union, not least with Turkey. And this is an agreement which is described as a success. Therefore, I wonder how on earth it is possible to attribute the EFTHET success to an agreement such as that when the Fundamental Rights Agency says that there are fundamental violations of human rights being perpetrated frequently. How can it be described as a success? How can agreement with an authoritarian regime such as that of Erdogan be described as a success while HDP members of parliament are being thrown into prison? They're not even allowed any sort of medical assistance. Numerous mayors, Kurdish mayors and others are being prevented from exercising their democratic roles. What on earth is the meaning of the word success in this sort of context? There have to be standards in the context of asylum rights, and here they are being woefully flouted. Italy absolutely deplores this, but it's not enough just to say that this is not good enough. We need to look at the whole question of the funds and the Stability Pact and see exactly what the implications are. This is not enough. I've been to Bari, Crotone. I've been to many other places in the south of Italy where I've seen men and women. I've looked them in the face and they've been there for months, living in a limbo. Men and women who have come through the relocation program and have no idea where they're going to end up. This is absolutely shameful. Why don't you go, as I did, and see the volunteers working for Mediterranean Hope and other projects? Why don't you go and see these individuals? Why don't you go and see the people who are working in humanitarian corridors and see how difficult it is, how solidarity is actually not working, how Italy actually is being left on its own? I don't want these people to die. I don't want these men and women to die, to drown in the Mediterranean. I don't want them to come and suffer in the south of Italy. This is absolutely shocking manifestation of Europe. Mr. Weber mentioned Altiero Spinelli. Now I think that the Manifesto of Ventotene ought to become the manifesto for this Europe, and if only it could be, then perhaps we would all finally be able to agree on something.
Verbunden mit dem Glückwunsch zu Ihrer Wahl.
Well, together with congratulations on your vote as co-chair of the party group, I'd like to welcome Mrs. Keller.
Thank you. Colleagues have mentioned it. There's horrendous atrocities happening right now in Aleppo, right now while we speak. And the question to all of us is, what will the world do to stop that? We cannot just stand and watch this. And the question to you, Mr. Korčok, is, what will the European Council do? Will it send a strong signal, a strong message, or will it indeed stand and watch? And what will you do? What will the European Union do to ensure that those Syrians who have managed to flee from their country, from bombs and from terror, what will you do, what will we do to help those people find adequate international protection? And if we can trust the Council conclusions that are circulating, the answer is nothing, really nothing and nada. Where is the resettlement scheme that we urgently need to get people out of the horrendous situation that we have in Lebanon and in Jordan? Where is any message to the people fleeing that they are not alone, that we will help them? Instead, we have the Belgian government, for example, fighting about giving humanitarian visa or not to one single Syrian family. Or on relocation, people that are already here, nothing. Less than 10,000 people have been relocated from Greece and from Italy. So how does this fit together with the concept of the union that delivers? It clearly doesn't deliver, even on things that have already been agreed. And on top of that, the Commission is even recommending to send refugees back to Greece. That is ridiculous. Where is the solidarity? Where is even the common sense in the Council? And what role are you, Mr. Korčok? What role is your presidency planning to play in all of this? On migration, it seems that the only thing that member states can agree to do is close the doors and do everything to keep migrants and refugees out. And for that, you're even prepared to do dirty deals with whomever in the world. You want to return, and you are returning, member states are returning people to countries where just the other day we've been sending soldiers and armies. How can we return people to Afghanistan, to Mali, where we have soldiers to protect a peace that's not really existing? How can we assume it's safe for people when we're also sending soldiers? And I think if we proceed like this, we together as European Union, if we forget about our own values, then we can also forget about promoting human rights elsewhere in the world. Because if we're not true to our own principles at home, then we're just becoming laughing stock in the world, and there's other people who are competing for that role at the moment. On external security and defense, it seems that you just want to throw around more money and more papers with fancy titles. And while there's absolutely nothing wrong with fancy titles, money is urgently needed elsewhere. We need it for investment. We need to fight unemployment. We need to have it for social justice. And by the way, we would have also some more money available if the Council would finally get serious about tax evasion. So I suggest you focus on the issues that have already been talked about so many times so many years ago, like, for example, pooling and sharing, instead of nurturing the defense and military industry, because that particular industry is actually doing pretty well. Thank you very much. So, Presidents, the European Council is meeting at a very crucial moment, at a very crucial time, and colleagues have been mentioned that. There is a lot of tasks, a lot of challenges ahead, and it's vital that we get it right. So I really hope the Council can send an important signal for Europe, for solidarity, and for human rights. And for that, I wish you all the best success and good luck. And if you do so, then of course we're ready to support you. But from the Council conclusions we've seen so far, unfortunately we cannot expect that, but I hope you can change that. Thank you.
Frau Keller, es gibt eine Frage des Herrn Abgeordneten.
Mrs. Keller, there's a question from Mr. Etheridge for you. Go ahead.
Good morning and Merry Christmas. Congratulations on your new role. There's a lot of passion about Aleppo today. Do you agree with me, first of all, obviously, that war is best avoided? Now, the ways to avoid war would be, first of all, to stop crazy foreign interventions that are totally unnecessary, to stop political posturing that pushes people like crazy tyrants in Russia to the edge of having to respond, but also that peace can be best achieved through strength, and strength is best achieved through NATO, not some harebrained scheme of European defence armies that will never work, absolutely preposterous, and thank God will never in future have UK troops in them.
Thank you for the question. I think we are the strongest if we work together in a European cooperation. We're stronger together. We can move things in the world together. And we need to do so, always having in mind to achieve peace, to achieve human rights, and to achieve democracy and the values that all human beings want to achieve. Because we're all striving for peaceful existence. We're all striving to have our rights respected. And we're all striving to have freedom and to have our voices heard. Thank you.
For the
EFDD group, the next speaker will be Mr. Farage.
Well, I think we can all agree that 2016 has been a momentous, indeed historic year. And as it's Christmas, let's think of those events in terms of the three wise men bearing their gifts. First, we had the Brexit deliverance. Then we had the Trump triumph. And then thirdly, of course, the Italian rebellion. It's just that in this case, the gifts were all the same. Democracy and the rebirth of the nation state. And I really think you better listen, because I know in the past you've managed to ignore Danish, Dutch, Irish and French referendums, but this time it is for real. A democratic revolution has begun. And yet, when the 28 leaders of the EU countries meet tomorrow, on the agenda, I see no sign of humility, I see no understanding of what has happened at all, In fact, what I see is the implementation plan of the EU global strategy on security and defence. In simple English, EU militarisation, the building of a European army, and indeed Mr Juncker used Donald Trump's magnificent victory to say, well, that means that NATO won't be here anymore. We have to do this ourselves, is what you said. And I think this is a huge and dangerous error. Trump is not a threat to NATO. He wants it to be redefined, and he wants the members to pay their way. It is Mr Juncker who is a threat to NATO. And you can pretend today, if you like, that your military structure is going to run in parallel with NATO, but those two structures cannot run together without being in direct conflict with each other. It was Tony Blair that first really worried me about this project when he said the rationale for the EU today is not peace, it's about power. And already we've seen that power exercised in terms of foreign policy in the Ukraine, where we have wantonly provoked Russia into, and we actually got rid of a democratically elected leader. You know, history is littered with conflicts caused by empires that seek to expand. And it's about time the British government actually stood up tomorrow and said, enough. This is madness, and we as an independent United Kingdom will act as the bridge between America and the nation states of Europe to make sure that NATO is secure. I also hope tomorrow that we see the British Prime Minister stop dithering on Brexit. It's been 6 months since we voted for our liberation, and at the minute we're being dictated to by courts and European commissioners and told what we can and cannot do. I hope we do that, but I suspect we won't, and I suspect the other 27 leaders will continue on the same course, and that's why you can all look forward to some even bigger dramatic shocks coming in 2017. It's going to be, for nation-state Democrats, a very happy New Year.
Herr Abgeordneter, es gibt eine Frage der Frau.
We've got a question from Mrs. Intveld for you. Mrs. Intveld.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just something that you said that I would like to ask your clarification. You say dictated by the courts. So do I understand that you now officially say that you no longer accept the independence of the courts, one of the pillars of democracy and the trias politica? A yes or no answer, please.
Well, Tony Blair did his absolute best to politicise a civil service that had been made neutral by Gladstone 140 years earlier. And yes, of course it's true. We have some people sitting in judgment who have actively been engaged in the process of European unity, and they, in those specific cases, should, I think, have absented themselves. But the real point I'm making is dithering. Had the new Prime Minister triggered Article 50 immediately, there'd be no court cases, we wouldn't have Monsieur Barnier talking down to us, we'd be getting on with doing the best we can under Article 50. Though I'm concerned, listening to your colleague Mr Verhofstadt, that once we trigger Article 50, it may become so unworkable that we simply have to say we're going goodbye.
Okay, das Wort hat jetzt für die.
The next speaker, on behalf of the ENF group, is Mr. de GRAAFF.
I'd love it if you just kept your speeches down to that level. Yes or no? Wonderful.
Wenn Sie reden wollen, wenn Sie.
If you want to speak, then you have the right to ask for the floor. Mr. de GRAAFF.
Vorige week werd in.
President, last year an illegal Afghan was detained for rape and murder, a 19-year-old girl who was in the prime of her life. She was working actively for the reception of migrants, and she was the daughter of an EU official. It could have been your daughter, she could have been my daughter. Politicians and the media talk about this as an incident, but in Germany there have been many rapes, thefts, perpetrations of violence, and many of them by illegal immigrants. this Commission is refusing to recognise that there's a structural problem here. There are tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of incidents such as this, but you were never actually prepared to concede that this is a structural problem. These illegal immigrants are convinced that they have a right to come to our countries and, if they so wish, to rape our women and our children. Yes, our children, because women and children, even at the age of 5 or 10, have been murdered, they have been raped, and you are refusing to recognise that you are in part responsible for allowing this to happen, because you won't recognise that we need a structural solution to migration in our countries and our cities. Nothing has been done to stop these illegal immigrants. You're working with a dictator in Turkey. You're working effectively with people who represent Al-Qaeda and Al-Nusra, the murderers in Homs, in Mosul, and way beyond that. You are largely responsible, and this is the message which will come out of the Council this week. It's high time we had proper borders. We sent illegal migrants back. We stopped Islamization of Europe, and we stopped negotiations with Turkey, which should never have been started. Thank you.
De GRAAFF.
Now, Mr. de GRAAFF. Oh, Mr. Verhofstadt. Mr. de GRAAFF, I just have a request for you. To say that migrants or refugees are systematically carrying out rapes. Well, I think after what we heard yesterday from 2 migrants who were systematically raped, then I think it's a shame and a scandal. You bring shame upon the European Parliament from what you said.
Sie haben eine Frage.
Mrs. Vautmans, you have a question.
A microphone for the speaker.
Meneer de Graaf, uw
Mr. de Graaf, your statements are absolutely intolerable. They have no place in this House. Europe stands up for the rights of women, for the rights of every citizen. Your statements are nothing short of racism, pure racism. You're treating all the migrants as if they are one and the same. You're talking about people murdering and raping women and children. This is absolutely sickening speech. And, President, I'd ask for this to be deleted from the minutes. This is absolutely not worthy of the European Parliament, this type of speech.
Meneer de voorzitter, ik hoor geen...
President, that didn't sound like a question to me. It was a comment. Now, one hears many comments, people saying, for example, that this Parliament stands up for the rights of women and children in Europe. Well, I think, Madam, that we need actions, and I'm not aware that I've seen you doing anything for the women who are the victims in our cities of all these illegal migrants.
So, das Wort hat jetzt Herr
The next speaker is Mr. Papadakis.
Δεν μπορεί να περιμένει τίποτα άλλο κανείς από...
Thank you. Well, you can't expect anything else from the fascists. The capitalist economy imposes this. There's no centre of decision-making that can really develop the economy. This is true in the EU and the Eurozone as well. There are obstacles posed to development by big banks, and they mean that we see new wars. It's a bourgeois system and just leads to protectionism. We're seeing that in the United States, in Italy, and in the UK. People work for others. Workers work for the middle class and bring benefits to the rich. We're even seeing it in Greece. People should revolt against these forces because all they're doing is carrying forward the interests of capitalists. We want to see an alliance of workers to break this capitalist barbarity.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the EPP Group, Mr. REUL. President of the Council, Commission President. Well, I must say I'm just absolutely speechless. If you see all of this chaos in Europe, where we hear people getting nervous, people feeling insecure, there is constant populism, people need to do something about it, well, it's clear that we can't continue with just making promises. We actually have to deliver. People need to see that some things are changing. I think the best comment we heard this morning was from President Juncker. He said, we have made progress. We have actually achieved progress. We have moved forward. We have delivered. That's how to win back the trust of the people. It's important as a precondition for that we work well together and that we're capable of acting. That means the Council is capable of taking decisions. That's something we've complained about and off in the past. But that also means that we in the Parliament have to get our act together as well. Now, colleagues, I really am shocked, dumbfounded, amazed, astounded. This is not the time for party political squabbling. I've seen that often enough in my political career, but now is not the time for it. Because, I mean, the winners will be on the far left and the far right outside. They've got Mr. Farage saying success is Brexit, success is Trump, success is the Italian referendum. Well, if that's what we want, if that's success, well, let's keep squabbling. I'm happy to take part in that, but I think that we should follow what Mr. Juncker said. Progress, step by step, making progress. That's what people are paying us for. That's what people expect of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Reul. There's a blue card for you. Will you accept it? There's a blue card. Will you take it?
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente. Dear colleague, you mentioned that we have to take action. In fact, the Council is going to speak about migration, security issues, economic and social development, youth, external relations, Russia, Ukraine. Don't you think so? It's time that, the European Council, altogether the European Commission, and with the European Parliament, should have to come with a new strategy, a new plan for a new beginning of the European Union in order to attract again European Union citizens' support for this important pan-European project?
Nee, ich glaube überhaupt nicht noch einen Plan. Da haben wir genug von. Sondern ich möchte Ergebnisse.
Well, I think we've got enough of plans. We've had plans and plans and plans. We've got proposals from the Commission. We've got decisions that we've taken. But just for some of this, the Council actually has to manage to get its act together. And sometimes it's us who are being asked to decide. We shouldn't just squabble, we should decide. That's my point.
Thank you. Mr. Guerrero Salom, 2 minutes. Thank you. It's at the end of this year, at the end of next year, 2017, I very much hope we can say it's been a year of at least a certain amount of consistency, at least in our diagnosis of reality and the cure we apply to it. If our diagnosis is that we have the same problems as we did in 2014, then the cure is going to have to be a complete review of the multi-annual financial framework. If the diagnosis is that European citizens feel unprotected against globalization, then we're going to have to move forward with European employment, with a minimum wage and more protection for workers. If our diagnosis is that we need investment in order to ensure growth and employment, then what we can't do is put the brakes on the 50 billion additional euros in funding, as the Eurogroup ministers did. We have to change our behaviour, and we have to ensure consistency between what we see before our eyes and the cure that we apply to it to try to solve our problems. I think dealing with Aleppo is going to be a fundamental issue for the upcoming Council to deal with. What we want to achieve is humanitarian access and access for food and medicine, and to work politically to try to solve this issue with Europe making its contribution. But we don't just have problems in Aleppo. There are problems in Greece. There are a lot of organizations that are telling us that the conditions in which many of the refugees in Greece are facing are unbearable and inhumane. We want to move these refugees to safe sites where they'll be protected, not just their lives are protected, but also their rights and their dignity. Mrs. Fotyga for 1 minute.
I reiterate on CSDP the importance to reach the NATO defence expenditures target. On Ukraine, with full respect for Dutch people, full ratification is a matter of urgency and necessity. On Aleppo, there is crime against humanity going on there. We have to ensure there is no impunity for those who are physically and politically responsible for it, regardless to rank and nationality. Thank you.
TELIČKA, 1 minute 30.
Mr. TELIČKA, 1:30.
Minister, yesterday we had, many of us, tears in our eyes. Some of us were crying, facing 2 young Yazidi girls that had the braveness and decisiveness that we lack. Now, is it that much different from what is happening today in Aleppo? I would like to avoid a situation that in a year or 2 years' time we will be awarding a Sakharov Prize to someone that managed to escape from Aleppo. And if you look at the European Council conclusions and the draft of those, we say we keep all options open. That is 2 days ago. Now I understand that the situation has evolved further, but it has not evolved dramatically in comparison to what we were 2 or 3, 5 days ago, a week ago, 2 weeks ago. So I think that this is really high time to act. And I mean really act, take decisions. This is what is expected. The second issue that I would like to raise is Turkey. I agree with President Juncker that there has been enormous progress in tackling the migration issue with Turkey. I mean, there are positive signs. But I need to take that aside from one other issue, an issue on which this Parliament has been practically united, and we have called for ceasing the negotiations with Turkey. There are something like Copenhagen criteria for membership, for conducting negotiations. There are people put in prison, there are people being persecuted, maybe killed, and we continue negotiations on accession with Turkey? You must be kidding me.
Merci, Monsieur HADJIGEORGIOU.
Thank you, Mr. HADJIGEORGIOU for 1 minute.
Αγαπητέ κύριε Juncker και κύριε Korčok.
Thank you, Mr. Korčok, Mr. Juncker. I think you have probably heard that we are all pleading with you to tell us what you're going to do and what we should do. We are all responsible. The point is that we are failing to take on the responsibility that we should properly shoulder. We are all responsible, and it is a weighty responsibility that we share for the terrible death factory which is existing in Syria now. We gave the awards to the women who were here yesterday, the young women who came to receive the Sakharov Prize, and yet what are we doing in areas such as Syria? We need to put our words into actions. We need to do something much more constructive. Equally, in terms of Cyprus and the peace negotiations there, the unification talks, we need to ensure that some action is actually taken in order to ensure that there is proper security for the people, the island, because the people of Cyprus are as entitled as anybody else to have proper representation and to have respect for their views.
Thank you. I would ask you colleagues to please stick to your speaking time so that we can finish in time. Mrs. Valero for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, President. 50 Afghans were forcibly returned from Sweden to Afghanistan yesterday, despite the fact that the Afghan parliament has refused the return agreement that Sweden has tried to sign with the country. They were also forced returned from Germany. Many of these people have never actually been in Afghanistan in their lives. They have been on the run all of their lives. Now we have the refugees from the terrible crisis in Syria, but it seems that behind that we're trying to get rid of people from other countries, to countries like Mali, which are also affected by terrible crises. Our returns policy is leading to more and more people hiding in Europe and becoming paperless. I understand them. I would probably do the same in their position. Sweden and Germany are now forcibly returning people who previously would have got residence permits under previous legislation. I think we would be in a different situation if all member states took their responsibility for the refugees who arrive in our countries, and I think that that is something that we need to work on in future, Commission. I think that there is one positive thing, which is that we should invest in young people. That is an investment in a more secure European future. There's a lot of investment going into surveillance and things like that. I think investing in young people would be much better.
Mrs. Ferrara for 1 minute. Thank you, President. The inability to face up to an unsustainable number of migrants means that Europe has to reform its asylum system, and it's merely giving money to keep migrants out of its borders. We've heard from Juncker that Italy won't be left alone, that we need to do more. But as a citizen of Italy, a country which is experiencing considerable pressure from this, I would say that the new Dublin proposal to try to distribute responsibility to all member states, so it will not penalise those in the front line. We asked for a centralised system to look at asylum requests, and that's been ignored, even though it's the request from the only directly elected body. However, there is an emergency system now. If I look at the proposed Dublin reform, we can see that the current system is about to collapse. So we need to do something about all of this before it's too late.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. As we prepare for tomorrow's European Council, we can only yet again ascertain that Turkey is actually not culturally nor geographically part of Europe, and therefore it can't ever become part of the European Union. It's not part of continental Europe. It's clear. And this is why I'm outraged by the fact that we have taken a decision that at the very least the negotiations should be frozen. This decision was taken by this House, and yet the Commission is continuing to close its eyes to what is going on in Turkey and to ignore the resolutions of this Parliament. Tens of thousands of people have been arrested by Erdogan. 100,000 people who aren't doing what they like have been, what the government likes and wants, have been thrown out of their jobs. Ethnic minorities have been persecuted. Women have been attacked. There have been attacks on freedom of the press. Many things have happened that are completely abhorrent. We can't have a partnership with a country like this. And look, it can never be a member of the European Union.
Mr. Fontoulis.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, if I look at the military aspects of the next council, I can see that there won't be any results at all. I don't think it is really acceptable for no result to be achieved. If you consider all of the work that's been put in, we need to get some results in order to improve our citizens' lives, so that there is a genuinely a perspective for a better life. Well, migration, refugees. I think that we need an achievement there. There are new calls for something to be done, but the migration flows in Greece are increasing once again. Now everybody wants to send the refugees back to Greece. But after all of the crisis, we need jobs and development. We need security. We don't need any destruction of our country. On foreign relations, I think that you probably understood that the millions to be distributed need to be distributed elsewhere.
Niebler, 1 minute 30.
Mrs. Niebler for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, President. President, Office of Council, President, colleagues. At the end of the year, the European Council should really not be engaging in business as usual. It should be issuing some very clear, unequivocal messages. And I think one clear and unequivocal message should be going in the direction of Turkey, and that is that we're going to freeze negotiations and talks with Turkey. Last session, the European Parliament adopted an extremely clear position on this. This is a country which, dear colleagues, has arrested 100,000 citizens. It's robbing them of their rights, and to my mind, it is a country which is very far from representing what is most important to us here, which is the democracy and the rule of law. And therefore, I would plead with you urgently to engage honestly with Turkey and say, frankly, that negotiations cannot continue at this juncture. A clear and unequivocal message is, President, you have talked about migration and about a series of measures which will be introduced regarding Syria, external borders, Frontex. You've talked about the Mediterranean. There's a topic you have not touched on so far, which is the common European asylum system. The Commission has put forward some good proposals. The Parliament has looked at them and has also given a clear statement on that. And we have said that migration and asylum has got to be approached collectively. We need solidarity, we need responsibility of all the member states, not least from your country, and therefore I would appeal to the European Council when it meets tomorrow and the following day to take some clear steps forward that reflect solidarity and give us a possible way out of this crisis.
Vous l'acceptez?
There's a question for you, Mrs. Niebler. Mr. ZDECHOVSKY.
Monsieur ZANYI.
Mr. ZDECHOVSKY.
Yes, thank you very much, President, ladies and gentlemen. Dear colleague, you said that negotiations with Turkey could not be continued. Well, a lot of people agree with that, but is it sufficient? Because we have situations where we've interrupted negotiations because of much smaller questions, where Europe has imposed sanctions. Wasn't it time to impose sanctions on Turkey, particularly in the area of,
Thank you very much for that question. I think that we need to be coherent. We need to take a step-by-step approach. Discussions with Turkey about full membership should be frozen, and that would be a very clear and unequivocal message in the first instance. Thank you.
Mr. Fleckenstein, 1.5 minutes.
Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, we also see the need to make further efforts in the EU to improve the security and defence policy. If you look at the threat of terrorism, if you look at the conflict in our neighbourhood, if you look at the policies of the Russian government, if you look at the many question marks that are hanging over the situation in Washington, then it's clear that we do have to take action. But my request to the Council is, please, could you make it clear that the Member States should be aware that this will cost money and Member States will have to pay. Make it clear to them that security and defence policy is part of our European foreign policy. It is not a replacement for soft power and diplomacy, but these two belong together. Please make it clear to your colleagues that arms exports and export controls on arms are an important part of that policy. And it's also a question of better efficiency rather than simply showing off muscles and starting off a new arms race. I must say that there has been there are important issues in your own country where we've seen major progress on social affairs and others. But at the end of the day, we need to avoid one result, and that is we don't want to find a situation where people say they haven't been able to agree, they haven't got any results, but then on our armaments and defence, then everything went quickly. We don't want to give people that impression.
Mr. KÖLMEL.
Mr. KÖLMEL.
Vielen Dank, Frau Präsidentin.
Thank you very much indeed, President. The Commission's position and the many contributions to the debate hitherto show very clearly that we have no long-term strategy in this European Union. We have no vision. We do not know what the European Union will look like in 10 or 20 years' time. Let me tell you this on the basis of 3 crises facing us: the crisis in Syria, the crisis in migration, and the crisis of the euro. These are 3 major crises, and we have really got to tell our citizens what our blueprint is, what's our strategy. We expect the member states to take certain action. We need to tell them what we want them to do, what we need them to do, and what we're going to do. We have to have a bit of clarity. We need a bit of transparency for our citizens. And I completely differ from a number of my colleagues who have spoken this morning, who've said that we shouldn't disagree. Well, absolutely on the contrary. We do need to disagree. We need to express different ideas. We need to express different potential solutions. And that's the only way in which we'll be able to reach out to our citizens.
There's a question. Will you accept it?
Pane kolego, hovořil jste o tom, že Evropská unie nemá strategii na více let.
Thank you very much. Now, you're saying that there's no multi-year strategy for the EU, but that's quite interesting. How would you imagine such a multi-year strategy? And my second question is, what do you think? Well, I don't know if I'm allowed to continue now, or should I repeat myself? Is that okay? Can you all hear me now? Is the interpreting working right now?
Alors, vous avez entendu la question de monsieur? Très bien. Voulez-vous y répondre?
Did you understand the question? Please answer.
Diese Frage.
Yes.
Meine Frage ist.
I can speak German to put my question. I'm talking about your comment on the strategy of the European Union. You say that there is no clear strategy. That's a very interesting question. Could you tell us why the European Union, in your opinion, does not have a strategy, and what sort of strategy it should be espousing? And the second question is whether the German government has a strategy.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kollege.
Thank you very much indeed for these questions. I'd like to respond by giving you 2 examples. First of all, the euro crisis, about which I spoke. Some 7 years ago, we adopted a sort of a system without actually ever coming to terms with the implications in terms of what we would have to do in order to resolve many problems which have arisen. We take 1 step forward, 1 to the side, one or 2 backwards, and we never get any further forward. The same is true with migration. We finally got to have the courage of our convictions and say, yes or no, do we want migrants? Are we prepared to have them? And if so, are we going to share them around the European Union?
Mrs. de SARNEZ, you have 1.5 minutes. Thank you, President. At the time at which we're speaking, there still isn't a humanitarian corridor in Aleppo. And so we, as Europe and the international community, should all be demanding that the violence stops and that we try to find some kind of political solution to this conflict. More than ever, we can see that the world needs a strong Europe. But to achieve that, we need the right means. Mr. Juncker is correct when he talks about defense. We're going to find ourselves forced to do that because the United States is going to provide less protection in the future than they have in the past. So yes, we need to have our own means to ensure our own security. Secondly, yes, we have to ensure proper surveillance and proper control of our borders, and it's up to us to do that. That's our responsibility. We shouldn't be subcontracting it to countries like Turkey. We agreed on a system, and now we have to ensure that we actually do implement the border and coast guard that we've been talking about for so long. We also need to have a proper migration policy to face up to this challenge. We need to show our solidarity with Greece and Italy, who are in the front line. We also have to harmonise our asylum laws, reform Dublin, ensure that there are legal points of access for refugees so that we don't see Syrians ending up in Canada. We also have to look to the south, Africa, and to have development agreements and partnership agreements with countries in this continent. Thank you. Mrs. González Peña.
Thank you very much. President of the Commission, colleagues, as we approach the end of 2016, we need to pause for reflection, because this Europe is further and further away from a democratic system based on democracy, freedom and human rights than ever. There are more and more people who think Europe is a problem rather than a solution. There's more and more scepticism amongst our citizens about Europe, what it stands for and where it's going. And in many countries this is becoming irrational. Racism, xenophobic attitudes, and it is reminiscent of the darkest episodes of our past history. We need to change tack in Europe. We need to change the policies, because the policies here at the moment contain the seed of failure for the European Union. You need to think of the families of Europe. You need to think of those who have no money to put on the heating. They can't eat. Austerity is tearing families apart. Think of the thousands of people who lost their lives in the Mediterranean because of your borders policy. Think of the future that is being robbed from our young people because of the policies which have made short-term and insecure jobs the norm rather than the exception. We just need some political conviction to change this culture radically. Thank you.
Colleagues, we're very, very behind on this debate, so I'm not going to accept any more blue cards, and I would once again ask you to stick to your speaking time. Mr. Bütikofer for 1.5 minutes.
Well, following on from the Brexit shock, Europe's citizens have given the European institutions an extra burst of trust and confidence. That's what the surveys are saying. If we are going to build upon this trust, then I totally agree with Mr. Reul. The question is, are we capable of delivering? We can't continue promising things to people. We have to deliver. And I get quite concerned when I hear from the Council that the youth guarantee is being continued. This is a clear promise, but nothing new is coming. One thing that would be new would be if the European Solidarity Corps were to get properly started. Mr. Juncker, you mentioned this, and I think that there's also a need for social initiatives, but we need more than simple redeployment of money. We actually need some determination to do more. Well, let's give a positive signal to say that we are going to do things better. And if you'd allow me to add an extra half sentence, I think that President Juncker, one of the major weaknesses on the agenda of what we're supposed to deliver is that Europe's showing less ambition on industrial policy than in the Barroso II Commission. That's something that you're going to have to change, sir.
Mr. Paksas,
1 minute.
Mr. President, we are constantly talking about migration and security, but our actions in this respect are completely not in line with what we speak. There is no universal security strategy which the European Council is going to talk about. There are only the interests of individual larger EU member states on the security and defense strategy. And so far, we do not have the migration strategy. This is the second problem that the European Council is going to talk about. That probably they will be speaking about the Turkish progress and agreements with African states. Are you wishing to get some specific solutions? Don't be so naive. Let's stop talking about irrelevant things and let's concentrate on the major ones, which are important for ordinary European people. They want only one thing, it is to live in their own state, work and earn a salary, build their lives in their native country according to their own rules. I hope that EU leaders will understand that.
Well, this seems to be quite a surreal debate. It shows that the Commission is in charge. We haven't heard a word about Islamic extremism, about ISIS. We've heard that the enemy of Europe and the world is Russia and Putin. There's secret invasion underway, that's going to be continued. Turkey can still talk to the EU and is receiving billions from the EU. And while we've been talking about all this, over 800 citizens have killed themselves for economic reasons in Italy. People are just talking on the left and the right. They're ignoring extremists everywhere, and they think that Putin is the one with dirty hands. On Syria and Aleppo, we will see that we need to put our feet back on the ground because we're not seeing much governing going on in this Europe. Mr. Wolf, 1 minute.
Madam Deputy Speaker, this is the third Christmas I have celebrated here as an MEP. Whilst I watch members of this House enjoy lavish drinks receptions and parties, I think of the millions of European families who will have a different Christmas, caused by the EU's failed policies, thinking and euro. One of unemployment, one of poverty, one of austerity. And whilst I supported Britain's votes to leave the European Union, I will also be thinking of Charles Dickens' Three Ghosts in his book A Christmas Carol. The ghost of Christmas past was the British people's yearning for a lost freedom and self-determination. I see the ghost of Christmas present as Brexit, a messenger of hope. I glimpse the ghost of Christmas future, where Britain's prosperity will be engaging with other countries across the world. I quote from Dickens, "I will honour Christmas in my heart and try to keep it here all year. I only wish the European Union would do the same for its people. But nonetheless, Merry Christmas to you all."
Mr.
Lewandowski for 1 minute 30.
Szczyt zamyka.
Thank you very much. We will close the year 2016 with the summit. This was a bad year, a year of very bad news, but we have some good signs from the labour market. There has been some revival. We have created 8 million new jobs, so we can seek some courage also in the news from the Great Britain. After Brexit, the Europeans actually have more trust in the European Union. We do a lot for the youth. Obviously, we have to fight nationalism, we have to fight populism. These are the huge challenges that brought also tragedies in the history in the past. We know that there are a lot of fears that generate debate here. I know that it's very difficult to harness those emotions. I know that it's very difficult to address the youth. I know that it's very difficult to talk to the young people who have never suffered in person from dictatorship in the past. Of course, we do not have to open the doors that have been already opened. We have different strategies, defense union, we have different programs and plans, but to win the hearts and heads of people, we have to show them that those programs do really work. We have to get and win the hearts of men in the street.
Mrs. Fayon.
Thank you very much, Chair. The time to stop the slaughter in Aleppo has long passed. We have collectively failed, and we have not managed to ensure security for the people. That's why I call on the summits to do everything to mitigate the tragedy. We still do not have functioning measures to face the challenges of security and migrations. Mr. Juncker, you mentioned the ambition to return to Schengen. So what are the arguments of our neighbor Austria to maintain controls at the internal borders? The Commission is tolerating this. Why? There are no reasons. This is only an obstacle for the travel of our citizens. It has caused great disgruntlement and mistrust. It has created an atmosphere in Slovenia where 1/3 of people would close the borders of the country completely faced with new migrants. This is the atmosphere of mistrust, and the mistrust is on the rise in Slovenia and elsewhere. We need a functioning and humane European migration policy. I'm sorry, but the proposal on the Dublin reform is by no means a proposal that would bring to life solidarity and joint responsibility. On the contrary, the majority of the burden will be borne by the countries that have the external border. And our inability to act and the lack of courage is leaving us without legal ways for migrants into Europe. We need to find a way to strengthen the economy and deal with the migrants. We need the trust of Europeans. Thank you.
Pour 1 minute.
1 minute for Mr. Lunas. Thank you very much, President. 4,733 people lost their lives in the Mediterranean Sea. Families, fathers, mothers, children. This is nothing short of a living scandal. 4,733 individuals. We have to ask ourselves, is the European Union doing all it could to stop this? Yes, sure, we have the new border initiative, initiatives to improve the situation in Africa, to deter people from leaving the country or the continent, but that's not going to mean fewer people are drowned in the Mediterranean. We need to have an ambitious, comprehensive policy for the entire Mediterranean. We need pushbacks, maximum limits, ambitious return agreements with the Maghreb countries. These are the things that we need. These should be our priorities, and we need to be aware of that. Let us not forget that winter is round the corner. It's already there in many places, and if we don't take action, the Mediterranean will simply become an open grave of an even greater magnitude, and that is unforgivable. Thank you.
Pour 1 minute, Madame Niriada.
Ms. Niriada, 1 minute.
It must be said that the ESFI and the Youth Employment Initiative are basically flawed. Youth unemployment in Ireland currently stands at 15.5%, and hundreds of thousands of our young people have already immigrated. We speak of our young people as though they are something way off in the future. The Council give them no priority in the current day, but instead placate them with promises for tomorrow, with no immediate investment being made available to create employment, something that will give our young people the opportunity to create proper lives for themselves. The EFSI, or the Juncker Plan, is yet another great failure, with no significant results to be seen. It is not transparent. It fails to assist those who are struggling to secure funds to invest in SMEs. There is nothing straightforward in it, and it certainly does not assist cooperatives and social enterprises as was promised. I now call for solutions to be sought within this meeting, and to the provision of adequate resources, instead of failing the public yet again by pandering to the rich and powerful. Thank you.
Pour 1 minute,
Mr. Lundgren, for 1 minute.
Tack för ordet.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. Well, it's heartwarming to hear that the EU is now delivering, that the EU's got control on migratory flows. But what world are you actually living in? The truth is absolutely the opposite. I think that there's blackmail from Turkey at the moment, where the EU is allowing itself to be blackmailed by a country where democracy and human rights and freedom of the press, freedom of expression are completely ignored and forgotten about. Well, you've got hopes of President Erdogan, but you don't have any other choice other than to hope. Well, this sounds like Mr. Juncker, like a fiasco and a failure. But does this mean that you could sit back in your armchair and let taxpayers take the blow?
Pour 1 minute.
Mr. Pretzel, for 1 minute. Ladies and gentlemen, we are talking here about Syria, and Putin clearly has blood on his hands, according to many of the statements made here today. The first genocides in Syria took place during the civil war's early days and are to be blamed on those who welcomed the Arab Spring and who afforded military support to those movements. The answer from the European Commission is partnership with Turkey. This is your response. Might I remind you that 500,000 Turkish refugees, internally displaced people within Turkey, are fleeing from Mr. Erdogan himself, your negotiating partner. Now, this is a very interesting situation. It is indicative of the current situation of the European Union. Mr. Weber from the CSU defines progressive forces and is using the benchmarks of a communist. Mr. Verhofstadt is afraid of the fact that we are actually putting forward arguments which are questioning the self-awareness of Mr. Verhofstadt himself, who normally engages in his regular mantras. Ms. Grosstedt.
Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, President. The European Union is proposing solutions, but the information doesn't always get to our citizens. Europe is not sufficiently visible. There are too many concerns that are not being addressed, and we see that in recent elections. There's migratory pressure, and that is often the main concern of our citizens. Europe's ability to respond is going to have a vital role in its future. That's why I welcome the first agreement for reintegration that was signed with Mali, and that allows us to tackle the problem at its root. But border control is still the main issue. Global stability is also a source of anguish. What's happening in Aleppo is a tragic example of this. The EU has to play a role which is going to be difficult between Putin's Russia and Trump's United States. So we need more solidarity in Europe. The community mesh that also has to have a role here. The situation in Syria, attacks in France, Belgium and Germany, the fate of Christians in the Middle East should lead us towards a strong defence policy to ensure our own protection. But it also means that we have to strengthen our development policy in Africa. Brexit negotiations are also going to be an opportunity to demonstrate our authority and to show what unites us, to ensure that we have decided on the United Kingdom question before the European elections in 2019 and move beyond Eurosceptics and demagogues.
Europe is at the crossroads. We have citizens calling for stronger solutions when it comes to economic, social and security fronts, and we have not only populist movements but nationalistic movements arguing that the best way to protect citizens is just to go back to national borders. This is a total mistake and a total illusion. We do need to have much better European solutions, and this is the responsibility of the next meeting of the European Council. We approve the idea of moving forward European defence capacity and bringing about a real European border. But we also must deliver on a real asylum system with relocation and resettlement of refugees. Otherwise, this is a total shame. We agree that we need to have a new phase of the European Fund for Strategic Investment, and we need to have a new life for the Youth Guarantee. But let me tell you, this is not enough to address the problem of jobs we have in Europe. We need to have an industrial policy in Europe. We need to have an agenda to complete the economic and monetary union. Otherwise, this is not a real solution. And more than that, just jobs is not enough. We need to have decent jobs. That's why the European Pillar of Social Rights is a basis which is coming up in the European Parliament, and the Council should build on that. So we are waiting for better solutions on the social front also.
For 1 minute.
Mr. Van Dalen, 1 minute. President, this Parliament wants to freeze the accession negotiations with Turkey. Definitively stopping them would be much better, but at least we have taken a step forward. The prisons in Turkey are full of opposition members of parliament, journalists, students, minorities of a variety of sorts. But criticism from Europe against the individual of Erdogan or his country simply results in him blackmailing us by saying he's going to tear up the refugee agreement and there will be refugees streaming out of Turkey into Europe. But we know that Turkey is not a safe country. It's abusing the rights of asylum seekers and refugees the country over, particularly in the south. And billions of European money is going into Turkey, and it's just disappearing. It's not going into reception centres for the refugees. It is possible for us to reach agreements which might help the fate of the refugees, but it's certainly not possible for us to do it through this agreement with Turkey. We need to stop negotiations with Turkey. And another question to you, where is Mr. Juncker in all this?
For 1 minute, Madame Björk.
Ms. Björk, 1 minute.
Tack så mycket.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, Commission, Council, there's been an unbearable gap between words and action, between what the EU says it will do and what it actually does. Peace means militarization and moving towards NATO. That's dangerous and it's the wrong path. Europe's development aid is not going towards fighting poverty, but rather to dealing with the sources of migration, apparently. It seems that rather we're doing everything possible to stop people who are trying to escape. And then with Mr. Erdogan, we need to end the agreement, and we need to do that by providing dignified reception for all people who seek safety in Europe. Words and acts need to be brought into line. We need to show genuine respect for human rights and the rule of law, and we need to show real solidarity with people who are refugees. People need to be received well in Greece and on their long routes here.
Tomorrow you should reflect on what a great year it's been for democracy. Brexit, the election of Mr. Trump, the great work done by our Austrian friends in their presidential elections. And let's not forget the Ukraine referendum in the Netherlands and the no vote against Renzi in the Italian referendum. And the best is yet to come. In the UK and in the US, the people are taking back control. You hate referendums. In here, you'd rather have them banned. Fortunately, we have an exciting year coming up. We're full of general elections next year. In March, we have the Dutch elections where Geert Wilders is likely to become Prime Minister. In April, we have elections where Marine Le Pen is likely to become President. And in September, the Alternative for Deutschland will continue its rise in Germany. For the people are rejecting your asylum and migration policies. They don't want EU trade schemes. They don't want EU armies, nor your obsession with gender and windmills. None of your plans will survive the coming years because the peoples of Europe have had enough. Democracy will prevail. You condemn the populists, but you're happy to cohort with communists and extremists on the left. However, I wish you all a happy Christmas and a very good New Year.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. We say that we have a lot of very important issues to be dealt with the European Union. However, the situation is slightly better than a year ago. I would like to thank the Slovakian presidency. Thank you for your operation in this very difficult period. Migration, security, internal, external security, as well as energy security. These have been great challenges that you had to deal with. These problems join us in the EU because we also have a lot of problems that divide us. And I would like to say that one of the very important challenges from the point of security is our difficult relations with Turkey. Turkey is an important partner, economic partner and military partner. Turkey is one of the main partners in NATO. We have to remember about this. However, the joint declaration of the EU and Turkey has played a very important role. It succeeded in limiting the flow of migrants via the so-called Balkan route. We have a lot of evaluations. We have also the terrorist attacks in Turkey, as well as the internal reaction of the authorities in Ankara puts this cooperation to the test. However, this cooperation is not only our internal EU problem. This is also a global problem, and we should react. We should make this problem international. I think that we should also introduce the Valletta plan. We should also accelerate all the actions related to the external investments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mr. Regner, who has 1.5 minutes. Thank you very much, Madam President. Europe, but not enough Europe. That's really what emerged from the Austrian presidential election, but action is what we need now. Action from the European Council, because the citizens want to see results. Yes, the Youth Guarantee is a very good thing. It's a very good European invention, and the Commission and the Council and the Parliament too have done well and done the right thing by young people. Youth unemployment has gone down, employment has gone down, but it is still far too high. 18.4% of young people are still without a job of any sort, and if we look at that statistic, it is outrageous. Young people who are not in education or training are much worse off. There are very many of them, 13.2 million, who are not in work, nor jobs or education, or training. Therefore, I know that the Youth Guarantee is going to be increased by 2 billion up to 2020, but that is not enough. It's just a drop in the ocean. It's nothing like enough. Of course, it's a step in the right direction, but we're not investing enough in the young people who are our future, and this is why investment is so absolutely vital. More must be done. You need to re-evaluate the Juncker FC fund, named after our President himself. You need to re-evaluate it, yes, but in the direction of making it more effective still and more efficient. You need new funding, and you need the new funding to be deployed effectively in the right projects, which will really help the citizens of Europe. Thank you. Ms. Tomasic, 1 minute.
Gospođo predsjedavajuća.
Thank you, President. The European Council talked about youth unemployment. This is a problem which my country, Croatia, has been suffering from for a long time. Since I've become a member of the Parliament, I've insisted on the fact that mobility will improve the situation and statistics in Europe, but it will also open up a whole series of other problems. Today, young Croats are leaving Croatia and can easily move to other countries, to wealthier countries. So these countries have very highly qualified factory workers, and Croatia has fewer unemployed people. Everyone's very happy, and these are good workers who integrate very easily, and other countries have better statistics. But what you have to understand is that Croatia and other member states in a similar situation are very soon going to have economic and social problems. Youth unemployment has to be resolved at the level of each member state individually, and not just by moving unemployed people to another country.
Thank you very much. Madam President, Council, Commission, we have heard lots of ideas and lots of proposals, but now the time has come for a new Council meeting with new negotiations, and I hope that you'll be able to provide results, much more results than we've seen to date. But I would like to take this opportunity to congratulate the Slovak Council Presidency. You've done an excellent job. You've addressed the issues that are real priorities for us. But nevertheless, we still have to talk about migration. 2 years since the start of this huge migratory pressure, 2 years on, Commission officials from a time when Commission officials were saying that there was no migratory pressure at all. But now there are many doubts and question marks out there. The problem has not been resolved. We're trying to subcontract out the solution. But the Turkey agreement is very hard to stick to. There are many, many problems linked to this agreement. But if we do not stick to the agreement, it could lead to a situation where pressure in Greece could increase once again, and the situation could get much worse. People wouldn't be able to be sent back to Turkey in that case, and the migration agencies are telling us that Turkey is not a safe place to return people to. But we still want to solve the problem with Turkey?
Außengrenzen kontrollieren.
Controls on our external borders, yes, everybody agrees to that. And the same conclusion will be reached again at the Council tomorrow. But are we talking about controls, or are we talking about closure? Just as long as we don't get any more refugees getting through the borders. There's hardly any movement on the issue of legal ways of coming into Europe. It's just a question of keeping them out. No solution to the Dublin system, no solution to relocation. and yet a determination to stick tooth and nail to an agreement with Turkey, where journalists are being arrested and dismissed, teachers are being dismissed, imprisonments are commonplace, and the situation is reminiscent of some things going on in Afghanistan. The Parliament's right to participate in decisions on things such as returns is simply being undermined. We are insistent on the rule of law and democracy, and if we comply with those valuable principles, we can make great changes for the better. I would urge the Commission and the Council tomorrow to keep this in mind, so that potentially there might be a chance we could be wishing a happy Christmas. 1 minute and a half to Ms. Gabriel.
Thank you, President. Commissioner, the last Council of 2016 will the one that sums up the year, and I hope it will be positive, but it also will provide projections for the future. Excellent work has been done on migration. We have laid the foundations for a new approach to migration based on cooperation, and I think that in 2017 we have to look at the external investment plan and a neighbourhood plan for Africa to try to deal with the root of illegal migration. In this context, I would say that the economic situation has to be improved in order for the plan to work. Our partners have to carry out the reforms that are necessary. Tunisia, for example, is doing that. Then, in the framework of this new partnership, we have to emphasize that we can only succeed if we're working with a country that shows a desire to work with us, including through readmission agreements, and only if member states use the added value that the Union provides. On security, notable progress has been made. We've seen the Coast Guard and the Anti-Terrorist Directive agreement. But given today's threats, both internal and external sides are mixed. We need a Europe of defence. The Commission has made proposals, and now the ball is in the court of the member states to ensure that these words become real. Then on Ukraine, you talked about the association agreement, but let's talk about visas. It's high time that the European Union liberalises visas for Ukraine, since they have met the criteria.
Yes, thank you very much, Madam President. Commissioner, I don't think it's enough just to cry over the dead of Aleppo. We need to put some force into Europe's negotiating stance. And clearly defence is required as part of that. I'm glad that the European Commission is taking on full-heartedly the question of defence, but defence doesn't mean expenditure. Member states need to take their necessary responsibility. The victory of Mr. Trump in the United States has placed us against our own responsibilities. But in the European Council, we need to see action. The heads of state and government are constantly waiting for the triggering of Article 50 by the United Kingdom. And they shouldn't just sit on the fence in the meantime whilst the future of Europe's citizens is at stake. So President Juncker needs to get back to work and make the Five Presidents report reality, so we have a proper, sustainable monetary union.
Thank you very much. Dear colleagues, tragic events in Aleppo were described by many of my colleagues, but I want to say that they are illustrating the problem, the very serious problem that we are facing. This is the problem of inability to act even in such dreadful situations. President Juncker has mentioned that we are working, and some of our works are delivering the results. And I really see some improvement in the area of economy, and not only. And initiatives like FC or Solidarity Corps are very good ideas that will make life in our part of the world better. And we should keep going in this direction. But at the same time, I firmly believe that priority for the year to come is in other areas. This is the security and our defence, in broader and more strategic sense. These are areas at which we must act together as Europeans and also as responsible members of the NATO. It's not enough to have a good security system, good weapons and dedicated soldiers. We must know what we really want and have the courage to take necessary actions. So that's why I am calling for the representatives of the member states in the Council to have more courage to formulate our foreign policy and to take the responsibility to act. Otherwise, the dreadful events in Aleppo, tragic stories that we were listening to yesterday, will not be finished. Thank you very much.
Madame Piri, pour...
Ms. Piri, 1.5 minutes.
Turkey, a country that last weekend has been hit again by an awful terrorist attack. This time it was in Istanbul. I would hereby like to express solidarity with the Turkish citizens and especially with the families and friends of the victims. The fight against terrorism is our joint duty and Turkey can count on our support. The topic on the plate of the EU leaders is how to react to the internal developments in Turkey. When it comes to the European Parliament's call to temporarily freeze the accession talks, I am glad to see that for the first time there seems to be a clear majority of member states willing to give a political signal. The signal that under the current circumstances the EU's approach can no longer be business as usual. Member states seem to unite along the position that no new chapter should be opened in the negotiation process. Although that doesn't go as far as our call, it does indicate that EU leaders finally take the clear position of the Parliament, the position of our citizens, seriously. It is important that we send a joint signal from the European Union that Turkey must return to the path of democratic reforms and respect for the rule of law. I hope that the 28 EU leaders will manage to come with a unanimous statement. Talks on accession are now not credible, but that doesn't mean we should stop our dialogue with Turkey. This dialogue, however, cannot be limited solely to cooperation on migration. It cannot be limited only to the implementation of the EU-Turkey deal. Thank you.
Angel.
Thank you, President.
I would basically like to start by drawing your attention to the fact that the coming year will be a very unstable year for the European Union. So it's important that the Council and Commission, but particularly the Council, should be capable of maintaining stable policies that have already been decided upon. The first, of course, is on the external borders, the Coast Guard and Borders Initiative, because it's clear that the refugee crisis is only going to get worse. And I totally agree with my colleague Maria Gabriel that we need to carry out a lot of preventative work in North Africa, and particularly in the Middle East. So that's one point. But another point that I think is essential is the financial and economic management of the European Union. Now we need to complete banking union. And there's something that's even more urgent, which is that the members of the Council and Commission should go beyond their official competences and become real political actors so that they can contribute to the financial and banking stabilization of the entire Union. Because if we don't do this, we're going to face a problem of such magnitude that all of the other problems we face, humanitarian issues and around the values of the Union, would be put in danger. And I ask you to please pay attention to this issue.
Pour 1 minute 30, Madame Gomes.
Ms. Gomez.
Raj massacrada. Putin
and Assad are exultant as the result of all of these massacres. What is the credibility of the international community? What about the European Union's position? The Ukraine invaded by Russia, Iraq, Yemen, Libya, Palestine. The member states are not coordinating together. They're simply rivals in sending arms to tyrants, instrumentalizing terrorist groups, countries like Saudi Arabia, and I certainly wouldn't want to put together an exhaustive list. Trump, Putin and Erdogan are happy to see this return to an intergovernmental approach. The German government has got no strategy. It could calm the waters, but it seems that they're more interested in feeding xenophobic populism. The lack of harmonization in tax legislation skews the internal market, and it's simply exploited by crime and terrorists. Then we've got Europe ended up in a situation where we're feeding the people smugglers and encouraging the factors that radicalize young people. And this isn't a Europe of peace. Intergovernmental Europe does not protect us. It does not defend us. It will destroy itself. It will put at stake our security and the security of the world as a whole. Thank you.
Monsieur Karas, pour 1 minute 30.
Thank you, Mr. Karas. 1.5 minutes. President, Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen, it's not a question of proposals and decisions that we need regarding all these topics on the agenda of the European Council. It's a question of commitment. Nationalism and populism and the lack of ability to implement the agreements is what is actually stopping progress. The need for unanimity is actually meaning that we're hamstrung in terms of implementation of these initiatives. We have plenty ideas that have been agreed, but please put words into action. The battle against unemployment isn't just a question of money. It's a question of policy implementation. It's a question of structural causes. You need to address the education policy in the community. You need to address further education, training, fiscal policy, budgetary policy. There are many initiatives, many areas where we could benefit mutually. We could learn a lot. The EU of the monetary union needs to become an economic union, a social union, a policy union, and the same is true of defence policy too. I welcome the action plan. I think it's vital that we invest in research, in procurement, in financing, in cooperation. But in terms of implementation, there is a woeful deficit. We don't have enough staff, we don't have enough money, we don't have anything like enough efficiency in any of our member states, and this is costing us a huge amount of money. The lack of cooperation is costing us 25 to 100 billion euros per year. We need to tackle these problems. It's absolutely vital. It's essential. Let's do it.
Jáuregui Atondo, 1 minute.
Mr. Jáuregui Atondo, 1 minute.
Nos proponía
Juncker was proposing the possibility that we would build Europe with small stories for tomorrow, for the future. He said this morning in his speech. So let's look at 2 stories, 2 narratives for the next few years. The first one is the possibility that the European Union should communicate to citizens that if there is a minimum wage, for example, around 60% of the average wage in the European Union, that would be good news. This would be a narrative that would help build Europe. And I have the impression that Europe has to send positive messages to our citizens. So let's imagine we did that. Let's imagine that we had an agreement on the possibility of a guarantee fund for unemployment for those who've been unemployed for more than 2 years. I think Europe needs urgently to send out that sort of message, that narratives for tomorrow. But we don't need what I would call narratives from the past. We need projects for the future. Thank you.
1 minute, Monsieur Danjean.
We can but be happy that defence is on the programme for the Council tomorrow. Nevertheless, may I just downplay slightly the enthusiasm by putting forward 3 precise points that we have to take into consideration. First of all, defence was already on the agenda in December 2013. It's now December 2016. So we've lost 3 years because the conclusions are exactly the same as back in 2013. Secondly, we talk a lot about cooperation and complementarity with NATO. That's very important. NATO has a big role to play, but let's not forget that as of January we'll have Mr. Erdogan and Mr. Trump around the table in NATO. And I'm not terribly sure that we want our defence to depend on these individuals. And then thirdly, industry. I welcome the commitment of the Commission to find
financing for the defense industry, but let's not forget that it is the states and the states alone that keep this going, because they're the only clients. So therefore, the European heads of state and government must buy European when there's European available.
Mr. Pittella, 1 minute.
Foreign ministers for the first time yesterday did not adopt joint conclusions. There is no consensus around EU-Turkey relations. There is no consensus among the member states on the redistribution of 60,000 refugees. In the meantime, we have witnessed humanitarian disasters from Aleppo to Mosul. Thousands of people have to find a new home. The question remains whether future relations with Turkey will be based exclusively on security arrangements or also on the respect for democratic standards. The EU should not compromise its standards. It should focus more on its own security mechanisms. The impossibility of the EU to provide security to its citizens can permanently change the focus from joint to national solutions. It is good that youth employment and the review of the Strategic Investment Fund have been put on the agenda, especially after the increase of the amount for the youth guarantee in the next budget. But the fund will be successful only if it will ensure more even geographic distribution and general economic circumstances in member states. Thank you.
1 minute 30 pour Monsieur.
1.5 minutes for Mrs. Speaker.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. It is good that the Council will focus tomorrow on youth employment, social Europe, etc. It is true that today the European Union is not present. The international community failed in Syria. Hundreds of thousands of civilians, of women and women, are going through hell right now. We have to be aware of that, and tomorrow the Council has its meeting. We need to make sure that humanitarian aid reaches those who need it in the field. We have to be clear in sending the message that the situation in Aleppo has been caused by Russian bombing of women and children. I agree with Mr. Weber. Sanctions to Russia should be renewed. This is a policy. We need to have a policy with. We need to feel sympathy with the victims in Istanbul. Obviously, we are not happy with what Erdogan is doing. When it comes to the EU, I need to stress that we need to continue cooperating, and we need to focus on the mainstream agenda. We shouldn't give more space neither to populists nor extremists. This is our task in the European Parliament.
Signor
President, I don't feel that I can share the optimism of the President in Office of Council and of the Commission on the outcome of the next European Council, and I don't feel any happiness for the results achieved on the redistribution of migrants on European soil. I'm not happy either how the EU-Turkey agreement has been implemented. I'd like to remind you that the meagre results achieved so far on migration issues have been possible thanks to the role of the co-legislators in the European Parliament, a role that we will defend against any attempt to get sort of an agreement behind closed door. The resolution here on a holistic approach to the migration issue has to be the basis for our debate for a sustainable development of the migratory phenomenon. Solidarity is a key principle of our rule of law and democracy. It's not a mechanism just to be triggered off when a member state is overwhelmed. Solidarity can never be flexible. And finally, in Aleppo, it's enough to have fine speeches. We want unanimous condemnation, and that's to be followed by a political resolution which will stop the massacres which are underway. And then we've got to give massive aid for reconstruction. Thank you very much.
Merci, Madame Bresso.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Bresso, to wind up. 1 minute. Last speaker. Thank you, President, honourable members. It's important that this Parliament send out a clear message to the heads of state and government. Our citizens are asking for practical answers, and immediately. I'd like to concentrate on the issue of investments, in particular on EFSI that's going to be discussed tomorrow. For too long now, Europe has been waiting for a recovery that's a real recovery, and it's the lack of investment that's one of the major brakes on investment. And the Juncker plan admits that in a globalized world in which all the major players support their own economies, well, there the European Union has to do the same, even if the figures at the moment are not enough to guarantee the necessary flow of investments and not enough to make our European Union strong and competitive. EFSI has been a very good investment which has brought some benefits on the ground, and now we have to insist, we have to increase the funds available, and we have to correct those aspects of EFSI which haven't worked. And two crucial points, geographical cover, which has to be broadened, and then synergy and coordination with structural funds. Thank you very much.
Merci.
Thank you very much. Well, I've got quite a long list for Catch the Eye. We'll try to get through the list if everyone sticks to their speaking time. And we'll start with Mrs. Virkkunen for 1 minute.
Puhemies.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. The EU's summit, well, there are some place for some serious debate there. Way too often from month to month the same matters are on the agenda, but good solutions are not found, and then when decisions are made we need to implement them. This eats up the credibility of the whole EU unless we implement the decisions made. I'm referring especially to the migration crisis here. Another important topic is the EU's values. We need to dare to defend the EU's values inside the EU as well as outside. Liberty of expression, human rights, the rule of law. And I'm referring especially to the Turkey EU negotiations, accession negotiations. We should freeze them at this situation until Turkey decides which path to follow. The most urgent matter this week is, of course, the situation in Syria, the situation in Aleppo, which is a catastrophe. Here we need common action at EU level quickly.
Monsieur Caputo.
Mr. Caputo.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, President. The question of migration remains at the heart of our discussion at the European Council, and Europe should now be carefully taking a new look at the implementation of the EU-Turkey agreement, which I think has failed as a preventive measure, bearing the number of deaths in the Mediterranean, which has now become the major channel for getting to Europe. And I think it's also necessary to assess the achievement made on the compacts that we signed with African countries. We need to look at the question of strengthening the European Union cooperation in the field of external security and external defence. It's necessary to accelerate the creation of a European Fund for Defence and the implementation of the European Action Plan for Defence. The leaders must look at the problem, the urgent problem of young people who are unemployed. We need to have measures to improve the youth guarantee, and we need to improve the mobility of young people. And finally, the European Union must condemn very firmly the indiscriminate bombing of Aleppo. Impunity for such crimes can no longer be tolerated, and European leaders must act immediately. Thank you.
Monsieur Marias.
Mr. Marias.
Thank you, Madam President. Mr. Juncker and Mr. Korčok, at the start of today's debate, said they were satisfied with the refugee situation with regard to Greece. I'm afraid they are not au fait with what's happening on the islands. 16,500 people at least have been, and illegal immigrants, have been put into an enclave. And because of that situation, there are clashes involving refugees in the hotspots. In Samos and in Lesbos, things cannot get any worse. They have come to as much as they can stand because the rule of law has been undermined, and we need immediate action for relocation from Greece. And with Dublin III, where people have gone into the countries of the hard core of Europe, they cannot be sent back to Greece as a country of first entry. Thank you very much. Mr. Epitideos. Thank you very much, Madam President. Tomorrow, once again, the Council is to meet to discuss the same things. But will any decisions be taken which will help to get forward movement and solve the big problems facing the European Union? For example, will we see a stop to the accession negotiations with Turkey so that Mr. Erdogan cannot have bargaining chips with which to force the European Union's hand and blackmail us when it comes to refugees? Will a decision be taken to stop youth unemployment, which is at record levels in Greece? What we need is not just more conclusions. We want to make sure that young people have the skills and qualifications which will help them into work. This is not the time for us to be pushing towards militarisation of the European Union and big decisions on the economic front. Those are the bread and butter issues which have arisen in Greece and which are relevant elsewhere. Those are the sectors where there should be solidarity and cooperation. Thank you very much, Mr. Epitideos. Mrs. Šojdrová, 1 minute.
Prezident, vážený pane státní tajemníku, vážený pane komisaři, já osobně hodnotím slovenské předsednictví pozitivně.
Thank you very much. I appreciate what the Slovak presidency has done, and particularly the effective solidarity that they've applied to solving the refugee crisis. I also like the dual system that was suggested in the correspondence directive, but we all need to criticize ourselves when it comes to the overall results of the Commission. The President of Parliament and the Commission have not worked sufficiently to convince the UK electorate to remain within the EU. We need to think about real priorities, and that should be on the agenda of the Council. In the programme, I don't see any clear reaction when it comes to the bombardment of Aleppo and the suffering of the civilian population. What interest is at stake when we see the Russian planes bombing? How can we end the suffering of the civil population?
1 minute.
Mr. Mavrides, 1 minute. Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, in these draft conclusions from Council, in paragraph 23, it talks about the interest in the Commission's work to enhance, to upgrade customs union cooperation between the EU and Turkey. Now, I had to read this twice. It talks about upgrading the relations. This is incredible. Any citizen across the European Union will look at the Erdogan regime as being authoritarian. And yet, here, it seems that the heads of the European Union are simply turning a blind eye to that. That's why you've got Euroscepticism. Paragraph 25 talks about measures which were taken in 2016 by being sufficient for Turkey. And 2 questions. How are we going to get a solution in conformity with the values and principles of the European Union when you've got an occupation force in place, and which has been there for many years? Thank you very much.
Monsieur Kelly.
While it is understandable that much of the debate today was taken up with the unfortunate situation in Aleppo and also the unacceptable developments in Turkey, I think at the same time it's important we focus on what citizens in Europe want at this particular time in relation to their own lives, and that is jobs and growth. And I welcome especially the success thus far of EFSI. And I had the privilege of hosting a conference in Dublin last Friday where Mr Cassoni from the Commission and the EIB Vice President also came and spoke, and they are setting up an office in Dublin, and this will help SMEs to avail of finance, which will help them to grow and create the jobs. We need that right across the European Union, because the European Union will stand or fall on the basis of what citizens think, how it affects their own lives.
Merci, Monsieur Donano.
Thank you. Mrs. Donano. Oh, Mr. Donano. Sorry. Thank you, President. Yes, the situation in Turkey is very worrying. And the European Parliament, through its motion resolution, has, I believe, made a good proposal to suspend the accession process for Turkey. The total break-off of negotiations would reject this strategic partner, but which would make the situation in the Middle East even more complicated. This motion resolution made President Erdogan furious, and he threatened to break the deal on migrants. And that is a proof that we've touched him in his deeply. So we shouldn't be looking at threats. We should deal with migrant issues without having to give in to threats from Mr. Erdogan. It's up to the Commission to speak firmly now, and the Council as well, with the support of the European Parliament. We should demand that individual freedoms in Turkey be protected, and that the assassination and the murdering of Kurdish people be brought to a halt. The question is, what can the EU do about Turkey? This is a question I'd like to refer to you here in the European Parliament. And now, Mrs. Spiraki, to wind up.
Thank you, Madam President. Tomorrow the leaders are getting together to extend the Juncker plan, Commissioner Avramopoulos, which has been very impressive overall in terms of success. But look at Greece, where the success does not read across into the real economy. 154 billion under EFSI and 1.5 billion, I think it is, for Greece, of which some goes to SMEs, but SMEs are not able to really draw down that funding, and it doesn't happen via the banks. And because of that, it's urgent that we create platforms, investment platforms, outside of the banking system. So yes, we approve the Juncker plan, but 46.5% of young people in Greece are out of a job, are unemployed. We must use the Juncker investment plan so that it brings real, tangible results for ordinary Greeks. Thank you very much.
That is the end of Catch the Eye. Mr. Avramopoulos has the floor for the Commission.
Members of the Parliament, the Commission has been working on a very clear strategy since the beginning. The strategy was not just theory, but had a focus on specific deliveries. For this strategy to succeed, all actors need to play their part, Member States in particular, and the support of this House has been more than helpful. When everyone takes up its responsibilities, we have tangible results. One example, it was mentioned many times before today, is the European Borders and Coast Guard. Tomorrow, the European Council will give further meaning and steer to the European Defence Action Plan. The European Council will also address two foreign policy issues. First, it must ensure that the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement is concluded. It is a matter of geopolitical responsibility. It is time to finish the work of this Chamber and of Ukraine's Rada when they ratified the agreement simultaneously. I would also like to congratulate the European Parliament for having completed negotiations on the visa suspension mechanism. Visa-free status must now be granted to Ukrainian and Georgian citizens as quickly as possible. And this has a major importance for the citizens of these countries, and it will be mutually beneficial for Europe and the region. The European Council will also discuss the war in Syria. It was said here, yes, the situation in Aleppo is grave. There are reports of slaughters, of children trapped under collapsed buildings. I call on the warring parties to see through the fog of war, at least for a moment, at least long enough to recall their humanity and to allow the civilians, the women and the children to leave that great green city in safety. Now, one of the next goals is to finalise the reform of the asylum package. On some of these issues I will come back later this afternoon, but I would like to say some words on Turkey. On Turkey, we shall come back later. I want to, however, express in this chamber our condolences for the terrible, for the horrendous terrorist attacks. This again shows that the challenges are common. It proves that the dialogue needs to continue in all fields for the benefit of both the European Union and Turkey. The EU-Turkey statement works and gives tangible results. We are committed to continue implementing it. On Dublin II, I have to be very clear. I have to be clear because I think there is a misinterpretation. The Commission did not decide to send refugees or migrants back to Greece. What we recommended to Member States is a gradual return to the application of the rules with the necessary safeguards for the best interest of these people, but also for Greece, which is under exceptional pressure. Greece's progress, despite the exceptional situation, has been recognised by the fact that we propose a gradual resumption as of mid-March 2017, meaning for migrants that will enter to Europe through Greece after that date only, and might try to move irregularly towards other Member States. But even then, it will concern certain categories, and it will presuppose individual guarantees for the transfer of its migrants that Greece should be in position to provide. It goes without saying that the Commission will constantly monitor the situation and update its recommendation if necessary. Ideally, if everyone plays its role, the implementation of the EU-Turkey statement should be accelerated, the relocation should be stabilised in bigger numbers, and no migrant or very few should move regularly on his own. And yes, the revision of the Dublin rules based on a fair distribution mechanism is the priority of this Commission, as it is for you, for the Parliament. I have heard everything you have said. What is important is that right now, the moment of crisis and divisions, this House leads the way for more unity and common European responses to common challenges. Our responsibility is huge, not to allow populism and nationalism to destroy what we have built, not only for the sake of our past, of our history, but for the sake of our future, our common future. Thank you.
Merci. Monsieur Korčok, je vais vous passer.
Thank you very much. Mr. Korčok, I'll give you the floor. It's a bit of a strange moment. Everyone is coming in. Please speak quite loudly. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam President. Actually, I don't know whether it makes sense to share with you concluding remarks on behalf of the Council, because if I look around, the members are obviously engaged in other activities, but I'll be very short. First, on Brexit and the role of EU institutions in negotiations once the United Kingdom has invoked Article 50. President Schulz will have an opportunity to raise this issue tomorrow when he meets with the members of the European Council, and I'm hopeful, let me stress this is extraordinary, that the European Parliament will want to ensure its involvement in this matter in negotiations which fully corresponds with the treaty provisions. And I have 3 additional points of substance that I'd like to make on behalf of our presidency on the issues that have been mentioned in...
Monsieur Korčok, un instant. Mes chers collègues,
Just Mr. Korčok, dear colleagues, could you please take your seats quietly so that Mr. Korčok can complete his speech? He has 3 very important points to convey.
First, TDI was mentioned, and one of the honourable members has referred to a blockade which allegedly exists in the Council on TDI. We are working hard till the end of our presidency, and I can say that tomorrow in the morning, after many years of problems to agree on it, the Council has agreed on TDIs, and now we are ready to start negotiations with the Parliament. So I think this is important. Second, also, EFSI was mentioned. Here, Council as well, I have to say, has reached general approach on 6th of December and is ready to start negotiations and trialogues with the European Parliament, while we, of course, take note that the Parliament has postponed this until May next year. And lastly, Youth Employment Initiative, extremely important area and subject of deliberations tomorrow in the European Council. I'd like to recall that the Slovak presidency was dealing with this issue within negotiations on revision of multi-annual financial framework. I'd like to recall that the Council is proposing to allocate, in addition for the Youth Employment Initiative, €1.2 billion till the end of 2020, which, by the way, is 20% more than the original proposal of the Commission. So those were the points of substance, and I'd like to thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.
Merci, monsieur. Le débat.
Thank you very much. The debate is now closed.
58